Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Shannon Derave-Ho from Creamer Media Webinars. It's great to have you with us for this webinar on gas, where our panelists will provide an update on South Africa's gas sector priorities and challenges. This session will provide an update on the progress of Bid Window 1 of the Gas Independent Power Producer Procurement Programme, including whether revisions to the request for proposals have improved investor confidence and strengthened participation in the program. The panel will also examine how gas-to-power procurement aligns with the Integrated Resource Plan 2025 and whether proposed timelines for both the IRP and the bid window remain achievable, given infrastructure constraints and tight global supply for key equipment such as gas turbines. Before we dive into today's conversation, we'd like to say a big thank you to our sponsors, Richards Bay Industrial Development Zone, Standard Bank, and CNG Holdings, for their generous support in making this important conversation possible. Also, just a few quick housekeeping notes. You'll find the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please post your questions there at any time. Our panelists will do their best to cover as many as possible during the discussion. The chat is open for your comments and insights. We encourage you to share your thoughts there, but please remember questions go in the Q&A and conversations in the chat. The session is being recorded and we'll share the link with you afterwards. We're also streaming live on YouTube, and that link will be posted in the chat once it's available. So with that, let me introduce today's facilitator, Jaco Human. He is an executive officer of the Industrial Gas Users Association Southern Africa and chair of the BUSA Gas Energy Subcommittee, providing leadership to industry on gas energy availability, policy and pricing. Jaco will be guiding the conversation with our distinguished panel, which includes Paul Eardley-Taylor, who is responsible for Standard Bank's gas sector coverage activities, Thomas Shaw, chairperson of the Gas Hub, Motlokwe Sebake, the general manager for commercial and stakeholder management at Rompco, and Thabiso Tenyani, the CEO of Pakwe Group. I'll hand over now to our facilitator to continue with the proceedings. Over to you, Jaco.
Thank you, Shannon, and congratulations to the Creamer Media team for once again putting a very timeless webinar together on some key topical issues. I'm not going to reintroduce our panel. I think most of them are well known, and it really is a very key cross-section of representation in terms of enablement of gas projects and strategy across South Africa. Now, I'm not one for cliches, but certainly we are finding ourselves at a very pivotal point in South Africa's gas journey. On the one hand, we are approaching a very real and well understood supply cliff as existing pipeline gas from Mozambique declines over the coming years. On the other hand, gas, as we see in the policy positions of government, that industrial demand, power demand, gas is increasingly being positioned as a very critical enabler in our country's energy transition and mix. It supports power generation, industrial competitiveness, and of course, broader economic growth if we get our strategies right. But translating that strategic intent into executable projects is proving complex in South Africa, and I think all of us can agree to that. On the one hand, we are frustrated with the movement of things, the speed and the criticality and the risk that we face as an economy. We don't have a supply problem, we don't have a demand problem, but I think we do have an enablement problem. We are navigating a set, of course, this is not easy. It is a set of interlinked challenges. On the one hand, you've got infrastructure, you've got pricing and affordability, you've got policy alignment, financing constraints, and increasingly tight global supply chains for key equipment. At the same time, there's a clear urgency. Timelines are tightening very fast, and decisions made over the next 12 to 24 months will likely determine the trajectory of the gas sector for the next decades or 2 or 3, perhaps. Today's discussion with our panelists here is therefore less about whether gas has a role to play and more about how do we move from concept to implementation in a credible, bankable, and coordinated manner. We are fortunate to have this panel. It brings various perspectives from gas across the full gas value chain, from financing, aggregation, infrastructure, and project development. What I would like to do is structure the discussion in a way that builds from sort of market context and confidence through infrastructure and execution realities. We need to touch on ultimately towards that regional outlook and what needs to change to unlock the required progress. So with that, let's begin by setting the scene from a market context and program confidence. And Paul, I want to start off with yourself. And from your perspective, from a financing perspective, have the revisions to the request for proposals for bid window 1 of the gas IPP program improved investor confidence? Or do you think there are still bankability concerns that need to be addressed?
Thank you, Jaco, and good afternoon to everybody. Just before I start, I've got to make one disclosure, which is I'm the lead financial advisor to the Zululand Energy Terminal, the targeted first LNG import terminal in South Africa. So with that out of the way, I think what we would say is there's definitely been some really big improvements. It's arguably the third time round that South Africa has tried to do gas to power. There was an RFP that was under development in the early teens. A couple of years ago, an RFP was issued, but there's some big changes this time round. The big changes are really appointing international gas advisors who've got a reasonably good knowledge of the market in terms of its international dynamics, but also the local dynamics. So focusing on the gas lens, other people I'm sure will talk about power. Some of the big changes, the gas pricing has been unbundled between an international component that's known as FCR, which looks and feels like international pricing. There's a new one called FFCCR, which is all about the infrastructure delivery mechanism to get the molecules from the import site to the power plant. That is extremely welcome and is intended to cover projects in South Africa, such as Zululand, but also projects not in South Africa, such as Matola. The load factor has been changed to a constant 50% rather than something that could become 40 or even 25%. That's helpful. There are some drawbacks, but on the whole, it's pretty helpful. The main drawback we see is that there isn't really too much clarity around what happens when the load factor is required above 50%. The trend of most global gas markets is when you have import provisions and you have the infrastructure, the gas demand goes up, not down. And it just feels that that's something that can be worked on a bit. You know, what happens if the load factor is 75% for 2 years in a row, that type of thing? Can you get medium-term pricing as opposed to spot pricing? There's a few technical issues which the suppliers have told us about, and they obviously need to be resolved. But on the whole, our perspective is that it's generally a big step forward. And what works quite neatly from our perspective, and I'm talking from Mozambique today, is literally we can see visibly the growth of Mozambique in LNG. The force majeure is over on both the land-based projects. 20 million tonnes is under construction or operational for 3.4 million tonnes, and potentially the 18 million tonnes of Rovuma LNG will take FID this year. So one can start to see that the geographic proximity of Mozambique's LNG, which is enormous, that can feed through to South Africa's gas provision in the future. And I'll pause there.
Tom, if I can turn to you, I mean, you obviously represent let's call it as a large industrial gas user, but also in your capacity as chairperson of Gas Hub, the industrial platform gas aggregator. I mean, from your perspective, I mean, we are in South Africa, of course, approaching a gas supply gap as existing supplies are in decline. And we have a certain couple of months left. In fact, it's a couple of months, if you really think about it, to find solutions. But from Gas Hub's perspective, I mean, how would you best sort of develop and proceed to develop the required infrastructure that industrial users are in desperate need to put in place?
Thanks, Jaco. Look, I mean, I think it all comes down to, you know, as a country, we need to commit to a demand profile, right? And, you know, unfortunately, industry at this point is still a bit small to be able to do that all by itself or arguably we would have probably just done it, right? So we are super dependent on ensuring that, well, on the country committing to a certain level of gas to power, which really then helps us fill the demand. And then once that's done, as a country, the country needs to provide the right level of fiscal support to underwrite the infrastructure that needs to be developed to allow this gas to flow. And in both those cases, we need clear timelines, right? It can't just be a case of, well, there's a policy position. We actually need to be able to know that on this sort of date, we're going to be able to depend on gas flow. And there needs to be hard commitments, right? Otherwise, industry, as it will go on and try and find different solutions. And then really, as we've seen with NECOM, and then you could argue the success of NECOM, we need something similar like a GasCom, also housed within the presidency, to be able to make sure that we can bring all of these moving parts together timelessly, such that we can bank on there being gas beyond a certain date.
Thanks, Tom. So I mean, from your perspective, it really depends on the coordination, and then South Africa's got to commit to a demand profile, and we got to commit to it. It means we got to put a line in the sand, and then of course the fiscal support structures, which then flows in a through a better coordinated mechanism. So on the infrastructure side, Mtlokwe, just sort of moving to your end, I mean, our pipelines that we have now from Mozambique has been the backbone really of our gas market for just over 2 decades now. As we see Pane Temane fields mature, how is Romco preparing for approaching regional gas supply transition and particularly in the gas value chain?
Yeah, thank you, Jaco, and good afternoon to everyone. I think it's obviously being a cross-border pipeline. We actually have to build relationships on both ends of the countries in South Africa and in Mozambique. And I think we've seen over the years in terms of this industry growing and having, a lot of the benefits that come from the success of the public-private partnership between the government of Mozambique, government of South Africa, and Sasol, which obviously is what Romco really stands, or what really Romco is. And we've been in the forefront of this change. I think we've seen the industry being reliant on the one source of gas coming from the Pane and Temane fields. And I think a number of conversations have been had around what we see coming in terms of the gas cliff, and that is something that obviously, as a midstream company that does not play in the upstream or in the downstream of this molecule, we actually find ourselves in the middle and very much reliant on what happens in terms of the supply side being able to agree with the downstream to be able to actually have a solution that we would probably come in as the enabler of that solution. So we've been very much involved on both ends in terms of understanding what the challenges are from the supply side, what are the challenges on the downstream side or on the user side, and also just preparing ourselves for possible supply options that based on a number of discussions that we've had with a number of potential companies that are looking to obviously play in that supply side. So I think from my perspective, it's more around making sure that we're ready when these projects eventually come to light, that we're ready to be able to enable the different solutions, because I think we do support the gas industry, and we're quite vital and we're strategically positioned to keep supporting that, and that's what we want to continue doing.
Thabiso, if I can turn to you, I mean, Parkway Group is of course involved, very heavily involved in the RBIDZ's gas to power plans, and it has had ambitions for a while. I mean, how do you view the sort of enabling environment, and what is Parkway's role and position in that space? You're on mute, Tabiso. Sorry. I think you're still on mute.
Yeah.
There we go. Perfect.
Thank you. Look, one of the biggest challenges we sit with is the uncoordinated process we're finding ourselves. The gas master plan is still under development. The IRP 2025 is here, but the timelines are not aligned to what needs to be achieved. The liquid site plan also, it's still under development. And through different administrations, you would then find that things changes depending on, from the fifth administration, they were saying this, the sixth administration saying that, the seventh administration also saying something different. Now, the most ready site for development of gas today is Richards Bay. It has gone through a number of processes of appointing VOPEC and Transnet pipeline to prepare themselves to facilitate the gas to power. Because gas to power, there is three components that are critical. You cannot build the power plant without knowing that there will be an infrastructure. Because the difficulty of any gas supplier, ask the question, is there a terminal which I'm going to be delivering the gas from? Let alone the quantities you require. Just that, if you go to Qatar today and you say to them, I'm here to source gas, they say, do you have a terminal? And if you don't have a terminal, they don't even engage you. So that uncoordinated process is critical, because it then calls for risk to risk project risk, because no lender would give you money to build a power plant if they are not confirming where you're going to get your gas supply and whether the infrastructure will be in place. So that's the difficulty we're finding ourselves today, and hence the postponements and the postponements. We had one of our colleagues here, Paul, indicating that from the starting point, what went out to the market was not much suitable to attract competent bidders that can then say we are prepared to be able to move with this. Now, to a certain extent, given the current gas cliff, which is now becoming an emergency. You know, I wrote a paper, 2020. I called it Gauteng gas crisis at the time, and said there must be an effort, an intentional effort, that we need to engage this situation, because the impact to the economy is one that the country cannot be able to absorb. 6 years later, almost nothing is happening. We have maybe 18 months. I hear the plateau is being stretched a bit, but even that 18 months, we're not sure as to who really must sit down and what should be the outcome. So when this decision was taken at a time that we need to facilitate gas to industry, at the time, South Africa did concede to the fact that it didn't have gas. So there was not a matter of policy. We did not have gas at the time. And therefore, then our neighbor, Mozambique, was having gas. And we then signed a bilateral in order to facilitate that. That shouldn't change. That's why it's a bilateral, it's state to state. Irrespective of one of our own corporate called Sasol, was the one then that led the investment of Remco pipeline, which has now been happily owned by most in the majority government now, which again, it's a positive, but it is also a negative because sometimes government is very slow in resolving and understanding private sector impact. So therefore, then we still need private sector to partner with government in making sure that the economy can be facilitated to a positive path. But our critical point is our plan called the IRP. It has wrong timelines that are misaligned.
Thanks for that, Tabiso. I mean, I would like to move the conversation a little bit on to transition and infrastructure, right? Paul, if I can come back to you, I mean, from a financing perspective, again, how do finances currently view gas as a transitional fuel? And of course, the appetite for funding within this broader energy transition landscape that we're positioning gas in South Africa, and then, of course, globally.
Well, globally, the position's changed a bit in the last 3 to 4 years. There was some element of doubt in 2021, the peak of COP26, JET, that type of thing. As a result of Russia, Ukraine, and now, moreover, the current crisis in the Arabian Gulf, the position has changed dramatically. From a South African lens, what's true is the banks have never really had to encounter gas in any real material way, unless you're active in the African markets, such as we are. So just to give a couple of stats for the audience, globally, gas is 25% of primary energy. In South Africa, it's 3%. South Africa is the only country in the G20 that doesn't have grid-connected gas to power. And for a range of reasons, that's going to change. Not least, South Africa has its own onshore resources. It even produces LNG in the form of Renogen. The Orange Basin you mentioned in your intro, Jaco, that's absolutely gas prone, probably to about 30–40%, and that's going to be a big feature of the 2030s. But then, of course, we have the LNG case. So as a transition fuel, the notion of gas as a transition fuel, again, the debate's moved on in a global sense. The phrase now is not about energy transition, it's about energy addition. A good example of this is in my lifetime, I'm 50, primary energy demand has only dropped twice, a tiny bit in the GFC in 2009, and obviously during the COVID period. Let's see what happens this year, because we don't know what's happening in the Arabian Gulf, but at the moment it's 2 out of 50. So as well as being an energy addition rather than energy transition, gas is now not known as a transition fuel. The phrase is more of a destination fuel. So the long term going forward, natural gas will have a key role. They are the debates that have not been fully played out in a number of global markets, but really have gone through quite a few cycles. The US being a good example, places like Malaysia, Indonesia being good examples where the trend in Indonesia in particular, which is a good parallel to South Africa, has moved from the sort of jet replacing coal into developing new gas fields, which Petronas and Eni are doing with some aplomb. So I'd probably pause there to say we very much hope over the next 2–3 years that all the South African institutions get the chance to really tackle different forms of gas in South Africa, the LNG imports, which we're talking about today, but then the onshore around Free State and Mpumalanga, and then above all else, the Orange Basin and then South Coast. Thanks.
Fully aligned with those views, Tom. I mean, from your end, if you look at LNG projects around South Africa, or Southern Africa, including Mozambique, which projects for import infrastructure appear most likely to move forward in the near future? If we talk around about the 2030 mark.
Thanks, Jaco. So, I mean, interesting. Paul mentioned Renogen. We're actually one of the main customers of Renogen at the moment. So, So I know that project very well, and yeah, that's been an exciting project. But look, we're very close to the BCG terminal in Matola, and like Tabiso has mentioned, the Richards Bay terminal seems to have picked up pace more recently. But look, both of those projects have the same challenges, and that, and until they've got the demand, the demand wrapped up, and the transactions that are guaranteed, they're still going to face some challenges. Equally, we're quite excited about the ENH terminal, which we learned about, which is earmarked for Inasoro, and that could be very exciting. We're watching that development very closely. I think what is critical to just mention for most of industry, which is based in Gauteng, the Richards Bay terminal doesn't offer a lot of benefit at this stage, right? You are constrained in terms of the pipeline from the Lily pipeline. So we really see that the Richards Bay terminal as a let's say a KZN solution, but not a Gauteng solution, not a country solution. Equally, the Kucha terminal could be more of a regional power solution, and likewise the Soldano terminal.
Tom, thanks. Motlokwe, from your end, I mean, with South Africa exploring LNG imports and new gas infrastructure, what role could existing cross-border pipelines like Romco system play in supporting broader regional gas networks? I mean, are you looking elsewhere on the continent also to expand your wings, and also in terms of value chain vertical integration into other types of infrastructure?
Yeah, I think already kind of highlighted, if we look at the current model of the transmission pipeline, is that you're pretty much in the midstream of the gas or energy sector, where you actually are reliant on what happens in terms of the supply and demand having some level of agreement that that the gas that the supplier wants to sell is the solution for the off-taker. So in many ways, you very much kind of in the middle, and not really you're reliant on those two having an agreement or seeing eye to eye. So what we've also seen in terms of the company and its sustainability is that for a company like Romco to obviously sustain itself long term, is that it has to broaden its view, which means broaden its footprint. That also leverage on the skills that we currently have as a company that's obviously been doing this for 20 years. And we are actually looking at businesses that are close to our core experience, and we are pretty much wanting to replicate what we're doing in other parts of the continent. I think the gas master plan, the SADC gas master plan, kind of obviously highlighted in terms of the different demand nodes and how those demand nodes can actually potentially be served. So in terms of who we are as Romco, and in terms of wanting to broaden our skill set, we've looked at a number of different potential opportunities in the SADC region. The way we look at obviously the gas sector is that it's a regional, it can only be solved by a regional collaboration. And I think it's pretty much how Romco started. It was, you had a gas field that was stranded for years until Sasol saw an opportunity to actually commercialize that gas, and how that obviously spurred the industry. A gas industry was built off, having a level of understanding that once one supplier unlocks an industry in a whole. So and if you look at where Romco is currently positioned, we can branch off to a number of different demand nodes in the SADC region as well to enable the supply of energy to some of these areas that are starved. So that's how we're looking at it, and that's how we see the sustainability of our business.
Tabiso, if you look at some of these timelines that you touched on earlier, I mean, the IRP 2025 and the bid window one of the gas I4P, particularly given the infrastructure constraints, we also sitting with issues. We're sitting with bid submission dates which are fast approaching, and we of course, as industry, we're also in many discussions with prospective developers to understand where the market is heading. But we also understand that there are problems on the environmental appeal process, all right, that's pending, all right, that means that potentially these bids need to be submitted without fully environmental permits in hand. So how realistic are these timelines that we're setting ourselves out in terms of bid award and financial close on many of these aspects? Because what we see is that on the one hand, you've got a power initiative. On the other hand, you've got a dependency, which is gas infrastructure development. And we're dealing with gas infrastructure almost on an indirect basis through power, all right, which of course adds complexity to everything. So to date, one of our biggest concerns is that no one can tell us exactly when these things will be up and running and commissioned. How do you view it?
Yeah. Jaco, there's been 2 postponements of moving timelines. Now, no one understands the implications of that, and the implications are very serious and dire. Because and I've said it in Cape Town, that the May timeline is not practical because the issuance of briefing notes as late as last month would not facilitate any bidder or help any bidder to be able to spec that into their value proposition. That's number one. So I can say it with confidence that we're likely going to postpone again, and that it has a dire impact on 2 things. One, the infrastructure is not able to project real, because where they are going to really confirm themselves is when there is preferred bidders. And in this instance, bidders are going to be putting their bids, let's say in November 2026. Now, preferred bidder, July 2027. And then there is 14 months of commercial close and financial close, which lead us to 2028 November. Now, first notice to proceed, which is NTP, it will be first quarter of 2029. 29, 2030, 2031. You can commission, if you are lucky, have found a turbine available. Because every time you move the timelines, you miss the slots for the OEMs on the turbine side. Those slots don't wait for you. No, the world is building gas to power everywhere. Saudi is probably projecting 20 gig. Now, if you are lucky, you can order your turbines earlier, because those are the big lead items. If you are lucky to secure your turbines early, you can commission 2032. If you are unfortunately not able to get any turbines around the world, so we are heading for 2034. Now, the mid-term system adequacy outlook of ESCO seem to project clearly that we're going to have a baseload cliff in 2030. And gas can be the only faster intervener. But at the pace at which we are going, we will never be able to even build 3 gig by 2030. So sometimes it's good to work backward at the time at which you are talking about what you are talking about. And what would facilitate effectively an infrastructure? It's certain quantities of molecules. It must be clear, or else you are going to have a storage cost that is very expensive because you cannot clearly project what is your load factor going to be. I say we need an anchor plant first. Then the following other plants can then follow in terms of mid-merit, high mid-merit, or peak, but the infrastructure would be there. The facilitation of the infrastructure must be intentional, that it must be anchor, high mid-merit, or baseload. And we communicate that. That is why people build 2 gig. They don't talk 1 gig at the beginning. That's exactly that. And that is why my colleague here was saying that Richards Bay, it facilitates the infrastructure in the country. And then we can move, because we cannot even tell that when are we going to do our dome gas. Actually, yesterday, Total was in court. And they were saying it didn't adequately deal with some other environmental matters in the marine, right? Which is Total committed to be drilling the gas. So all those things, that is why we are calling for a specific judiciary to be able to look at the EIA's matters from a country's perspective. If you look at Section 24 of the Constitution, which deals with environment, I always tell people that there is the last bullet point there. It says we cannot protect the environment at an expense of social and economical development. That should be balanced. Any other fuel or solution that can be looked at to replace the base load, nuclear takes very long from a regulation perspective. So we need to be intentional as a country. How do we want to handle the gas? The lenders are ready to back, but with this project-to-project risk, we are likely to be finding ourselves where we are. I was saying last time, we got our first EIA 2016. We are 2026. 10 years later, we are still hesitant. We need to be clear as a country.
And I think in these statements, I mean, it is exactly where industry is now also has been raising the flags over the last couple of years to say we are running out of time, and these risks are compounding for the economy at this point in time. I want to move on and maybe a little bit speed up the program, considering the halfway mark where we're at. I want to talk a little bit about constraints and execution. All right. And Paul, if I can, I mean, turning to you, what are the biggest risks to project timelines, particularly around LNG import infrastructure, pipelines, and grid connections?
Yeah, as I mentioned at the start, I've got a ringside seat in this, so we're not short of work. It's an awful lot of fun. Essentially, there's 3 different pieces to it. You have the demand, which could be new IPPs, fuel switching, various other sources. You have the fuel delivery mechanisms, could be pipelines, could be small-scale LNG, and you have the terminals themselves. And as Thabiso has explained very well, the main challenge is parallel working of project management of projects that have to have some integration eventually, but are not all integrated on day one. The challenge for SA is it didn't build terminals 20 years ago. You didn't have a state-owned gas company do it, or you didn't have the equivalent of Northern Europe, where you had a bedrock of gas demand, heating for residential and offices, allowing the market to develop and then the supply back to them. But we are where we are. So the main thing, and this is really more or less on the same page as Tabiso, is the need for very close coordination of the different work streams. So the country has some advantages. One of the big ones is the technology has evolved in global gas. Your only option is not just a power station anymore. It's very helpful, and in some places vital, maybe not pivotal, but pretty important. But you do have options like LNG trucking, you do have marine bunkering. They can give you quite a few passages. So that's helpful. What is needed though in a couple of different places, and the two projects on the terminal sides have different strategies. In the case of Zululand, we're looking for a customer, which is a guy who will bring the LNG into the terminal and then sell the gas to the counterparties afterwards. That process is highly advanced. In the case of Matola, you have elements of integrated operation where the infrastructure owner is also the LNG supplier. And there's a bit more debate there around the gas side. Our perspective on it, and this is a personal view, not the IPP office or the bank or something, is that I think the terminals at the end of the day have to go first. You have a situation where the market, and by the market, I mean the IPP market and to some extent the financing market, is unfamiliar with gas. So it will be a reasonably confidence building exercise for the terminals to go first. They don't have to go first by too long, and both of the terminals to build are substantially quicker than a CCGT power plant. But I would hope they can go first. So if I had a dream scenario, we don't know what the IPP office is going to do. But my dream scenario personally would be you would have preferred bidders selected this year. There's not going to be that many bids. We don't expect so. You would have PPA signings, ideally in the first quarter of next year, and that would allow the two terminals to potentially take FID by the middle of next year, say the end of the first half. That puts the terminals in a perspective to be in a position, to be online by 2029. Then the gas cliff, which we mustn't forget about, the gas cliff would largely be solved. In addition to the gas cliff being solved, you have a broadening of the gas market in South Africa, and then it allows the issue that Tabiso talked about, which is a very real one, which is the demand for global gas turbines, to be dealt with in an environment. Again, this is just my own opinion. You have a conditional preferred bidder for the IPPs, where the IPPs, once their conditional preferred bidders, have to go away, talk to their turbine suppliers, come back and say, this is our schedule, and then they can be firm preferred bidders. So that's the ideal scenario from my perspective. But of course, there's many opinions in South African gas to power.
Thanks, Tom. I mean, in what are sort of some of these key technical and commercial challenges in developing these type of LNG storage, regas, and pipeline infrastructures that we so desperately require? How do you see that?
Yeah, look, so firstly, I just want to agree completely with Paul's position. I mean, I think that his strategy and his personal view in terms of how that should be done is, I think, spot on, right? And that really is made possible if the government takes a view that they're going to actually back SA Inc. and invest it sort of, ahead of the curve, right, and guarantee that infrastructure. I think if you look at the technical challenges, they're actually quite straightforward, right? We saw post-Ukraine war that Europe was able to have terminals built in months, not years, right? So it really all comes down to the commercial side and having serious people who actually get serious about this. And in the context of the South African gas cliff and our aspirations around RP 2025, this really should not be difficult to solve, Jaco.
Thanks, Tom. I mean, and clearly, I mean, what you're inferring is around the fiscal structuring and architecture on what Paul says. It's not a chicken and an egg. It's a terminal first, and then the market will follow. Matlokwe, just briefly,
just on that point. I mean, please. Putting my industry hat on again, you haven't had fresh molecules in this economy since for more than 10 years. So anybody who wants to run an industrial process which requires thermal energy from gas has just been they've just taken their money somewhere else, right? Sorry, I'm interjecting.
No problem, Tom. Key point. Matlokwe, briefly from Romco. Romco is a joint venture between the government of Mozambique and South Africa and some industry partners. What lessons from this partnership model do you think could inform future cross-border gas projects? And Paul touched on it. I also touched on it, and particularly from the West Coast. If we think Orange Basin as the exciting 30s for us going forward, what can you share from Romco's perspective?
Yeah, I think it's the Aramco is a good case study for cross-border collaboration because it's there's a lot of learnings that in the continent we can take in replicating similar type of projects. I mean, if you look at how much fiscal benefit both countries have seen from literally having a company like Romco. And that stems from having the experience of the private player being involved and also having government from policy or policy perspective be able to drive policy to enable investment in this type of infrastructure project. So some of the learnings we've taken from this is that as long as you have political will and you have a good understanding of the benefits that actually can come from similar type capital projects and how sustainable some of these projects are. I think it's also, as we said, I mean, there has to be somebody who moves first, and once that happens, you see how quickly an industry can grow. And obviously, an industry can grow if there are not a lot of barriers. And how government plays a role of actually making sure that it understands some of the challenges that private players might have, and seeing ways on making sure that obviously those barriers can be resolved. And I think that's how we see that similar type projects can succeed, is obviously having political will and actually having the right type of experience involved in those projects.
Thabiso, from a developer's perspective, like Parkway, I mean, you obviously have to navigate EPC contractors, technology decisions. You touched on the issue around turbine availability going forward. In this constantly moving space, I mean, how do you navigate that?
Jaco, good question. Look, as I say that we've been long on this path, and therefore then for us it was easy. We closed. I traveled to China because we got a clear agreement with China Energy on the EPC side, fully wrapped. We have one of the OEMs that we've been working very close to date. Because 4 years ago, we signed an MOU between Vopec, Parkway, ExxonMobil, and GE, I think, at the time, so that then we could have this thing coordinated. Obviously, with time, this thing gets to be disintegrated. However, I can tell you that the cost of megawatt gas, 1 megawatt of gas at the time, it was $1 million. It has shifted by 60%. So we're talking $1.6 million per megawatt now. So the price of turbines are changing drastically as the demand increases in the world. So we're going to end up finding ourselves where the tariff is no more competitive. Because as you know, that industry requires a low cost of electricity because it is the core input into the system. So we can then come up with a gas to power with a very expensive tariff that is not going to make an input properly into our industries. I advocate one thing. The issue of gas cliff must be resolved with Mozambique. And let's put a different group of people. Less than 3 people can resolve that. And I advocate that let's engage beyond this webinar and resolve the gas cliff, because the impact, as I say, is going to be dire for the country. The second thing is this gas matter. I am happy that I hear Paul saying it's a destination fuel. It's not just an intermittent that as people are looking at it. When that time comes, I want to hear from Remco saying we need to prepare ourselves to use this servitude that we have to double them, because at the time at which Eskom is going to then say coal has depleted and these power plants are now getting shut down, the reality of retrofitting to gas will then require a bigger pipeline than Remco it is. I think Remco is what, 220 petajoules. So that won't support the power station. So those are the plans that we need to start talking about, because we know that the country is going to require gas in a bigger way. The reason Europe is able to move with speed, it's because the industries are using gas already and they're highly dependent. That is why they solve their problem much more quicker. So as a country, let's not fragment in this particular scenario. Let us all get into one room and practically agree that our timelines are a mismatch as we speak today. And what is it that needs to be done now? Not next year, not 2028. We cannot plan like that. It needs to be now. The Sasol issue sensor was issued 2019, 2020. 6 years later, we cannot be sitting around and saying the gas cliff is not being resolved. It must be resolved, or else the biggest economy in the country, which is Gauteng, is going to collapse.
Tabiso, thanks. Just looking at our match referee, Shannon. I've got one more round of questions, Shannon, and then perhaps, if with your permission, I want to propose that we maybe overshoot our timeline with a bit of Q&A after that, if that's okay.
Please do.
Paul, if talking about regional developments and the outlook, I mean, how tight is global supply for major equipment such as gas turbines, and again, coming back to the South African view of timelines or stated ambitions, how realistic do you think we are?
To pick up your football analogy you just started, it's definitely a game of two halves. Tabiso's talked about the rugby, same thing. Tabiso's talked very well about the turbines. My general understanding, and he's closer to it than me, is for the gas engines, what used to be a 2 is now a 3. For gas turbines, what used to be a 3 is now almost a 4. And that's probably not going to change. If you look at AI, the growth of AI, there's a fantastic paper out there by JP Morgan Asset Management on energy, has a big section on AI, and the demand is basically till the cows come home. So that's one half. The other side, though, is the position of the global LNG market is lekker at the moment. You might not think that from looking at the news, but of the 480 million tons that was installed at the end of last year, 220 million tons is under construction. That is only going to go up. The LNG growth, especially driven by America, the country I'm sat in Mozambique, is going to be very large. Just to give a number on Mozambique, public domain, it will be 38 million tons by 2030. Our expectation, the Standard Bank, is Mozambique will probably be in the 70s by the mid-2030s. So there's an awful lot of LNG quite close to South Africa. So there's going to be some frictional dislocation on the turbines. There's going to be gnashing of teeth. People are going to wish they'd bought them years ago. That's the way it goes. But the good news is that there's lots of LNG available. And when South Africa needs the LNG, the country next door has a lot of it. Thanks.
Tom, if you look ahead 10, 15 years from now, well, let's call it 4 years from now, gas cliff point, starting point, and then from that point onwards, I mean, how would you describe sort of regional developments, particularly with Mozambique on our east coast, the Orange Basin on our west coast shape our gas supply options and the long-term viability of gas to power in the country, and how do these two feed into ultimately our industrial complex and power complexes?
Thanks, Jaco. Look, I mean, both Mozambique, as you mentioned, Rovumba, you know, and even Namibia hold, you know, incredible resources in terms of gas resources, right? And you know, Mozambique has obviously gone full steam ahead on LNG, and that's probably what's going to be available the fastest. But you know, but long term, you know, we see obviously LNG is going to sort of you know, provide the critical bridge post 2030 to make sure that we've still got gas. But long term, you know, industry and you know, cost effective power really needs to have pipeline gas in the southernmost tip of Africa, and for that we need, you know, we need Motlokwe to build those pipelines going either way, all the way up to Rovumba, or all the way up the west coast to where these fields are in Namibia, and probably are on our side of the border on the Orange River Basin, because that's how we get a long-term energy cost advantage, and that's what we so critically need to make sure we can carry on industrializing this economy.
But look, where, you know, your name has been mentioned, but how important is this continued gas cooperation between Mozambique and South Africa, or other countries for that matter, to ensure our regional gas energy security, and, you know, what Tom touched on, our industrial imperative, our power generation imperative of gas, particularly as demand for gas and power generation and industry is set to grow significantly?
It's very important, and I think both governments also see that as important. I think if we go back to the recent bilateral conversations that took place in November, a number of agreements were made around, you know, the development of gas for both regions. And I think if you look at, I mean, we've highlighted, everyone here has highlighted how big the reserves and resources in Mozambique are, especially on the Rovuma Basin. And there's obviously a legislation around domestic gas obligation for those volumes. And you look at potential demand for gas in Mozambique, you actually can see that the amount of gas that potentially can be DOM gas in Mozambique would actually outstrip the demand for gas in Mozambique. And for all of these infrastructure projects to actually take place, there's scale that is needed. And if you then start thinking about, you know, some of the demand in South Africa that can be served by the potential domestic gas volumes from the Rovuma Basin, then you start seeing that, you know, there's a level of, you know, dependency that we probably might still have from, especially if you start looking at projects in or the industry, the gas industry in the Gauteng corridor, that will depend a lot on, you know, on Mozambique gas for some time. So the way we see this is that, you know, Mozambique and South Africa collaboration or bilaterals still very important, and obviously also Namibia, which obviously has also become another player in terms of potential gas supply. So I think these conversations will always be important, and I think that's why we always say, if you want to look at how you want to solve the energy crisis in the region, is actually start thinking more broadly and looking at as, you know, a regional problem as opposed to, you know, an individual country problem, because, you know, there are countries that are endowed with, you know, resources of gas, and potentially maybe the demand in those countries is not able to actually pin a commercial or a viable project. But then when you start saying, looking at, you know, neighboring countries that potentially need that resource, then you start seeing that actually there's actually a business case. So these conversations are always going to be important, and I think we will, as Romco, also continue to want to make sure that the countries continue to have those conversations.
Tabiso,
Jaco, if I can,
Okay,
just
please,
want to make
please.
one clarification. Yeah, just for the audience, it's really important to understand what domestic gas is and what it isn't in Mozambique. So domestic gas is gas that is actually landed at the Afungi LNG site as gas. So if it's going to go anywhere else, you have to do either infrastructure to pipe it, or you have to take it in the form of LNG to South Africa. And the important point to mention, and again, this is for the audience, there's no such thing as a free lunch. The gas that becomes the LNG is owned by private concessions in Mozambique. And if they can sell the LNG to South Africa, they will sell the LNG. They're not going to arbitrage against themselves. It's just important to make that observation for your audience.
Thanks for those inputs, Paul. Tabiso, maybe last question to you, and then I've got an unscripted question following from our conversation today, which I'll pose to the panelists afterwards. But so, Tabiso, in short, I mean, what needs to change here to improve investor confidence in power infrastructure, gas infrastructure, and to accelerate and give certainty in terms of timelines, the fiscal underpinnings of these requirements and in development requirements for us in South Africa. Number one, to mitigate our risk, and number two, to fully leverage the gas requirements for the country.
Look, Jaco, we seem not to be very clear as to what we want. And for the benefit of the listeners, there are two types of gas plant you can talk about. There is OCGT, which is open cycle, and there is CCGT, which is combined cycle. Combined cycle is orientated and has a capability of being a baseload. Open cycle, you can stop, start as and when you want and as quick as possible. So you can't say we want a combined cycle which has 520 starts a year. It's not possible. The turbine that you are putting, the industrial turbine, we call it the industrial turbine, is not made to do those stop starts. Then you are going to call for a very higher maintenance cost, which then makes your tariff to be uncompetitive. So now we need to be clear there to say, is it an open cycle that we are looking for? And if it's an open cycle, then there's a different turbines you can have. They called aeroderivatives. They can start as quick as possible. So there need to be a clear distinction of what does this country needs. And once we have then made that, the timelines must align to that. And we cannot keep on clarifying in the process. We need to stop and say, is it a CCGT or is it an OCGT? And from that particular basis, I think we can able to move.
Thanks, Tabiso. I think we've sort of, the last hour was certainly, if I were to capture what our panelists are focused on, is that we are sitting essentially with all the solutions on the table. There are willing investors, there are willing users of gas, but we're missing something. We've heard in particular, Tabiso refers to we need to get in a room. Tom is referring to a GasCom / on the basis of a NECOM type structure. Paul is referring to coordination. My throwaway question here to the panelists, very shortly, who is the coordinator? if we say that we need to get in a room, whose room is it, right? Who's going to invite us to that room? If I can maybe, Paul, start with you.
Oh, it's the I'm Spartacus question. So see who it is. I mean, the answer back the other way is there's a range of choices in South Africa. You obviously have overlapping ministries. We all know that. DMPR, DE, among others. Maybe it being devil's advocate and to try and have a bit of impartial execution in there, I would be inclined to go for National Treasury. Because National Treasury is the arbiter of these things. They know the fiscal cost to the country of the two different cliffs of not having enough power. And if we spin it around the other way to the roaring 30s of the Orange Basin, they will know how much cash can come in from oil by that time, because obviously the neighbours to the north will do it. So that would be my suggestion.
Very interesting perspective. Tom, if I can maybe pose that same question to you.
So look, I think the Treasury definitely needs to be in the room, but I think if you want to solve this thing fast, like it needs to be solved, it has to be with the presidency. You've got to be able to cut across, energy generation, gas policy, Treasury, environmental, and you just got to get this thing solved, right?
Motloqwe, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm gonna steal Tom's answer or view. I think I also see it being something that is actually led from as high up as the presidency. I think understanding the importance of energy security and energy sustainability, I think it's one of those things that I think it has to be looked at from as high up as the presidency.
And lastly, Thabiso, your view.
One thing we're not wanting to point it very clear. Once you say the presidency, you are conceding to the fact that the minister responsible is not competent enough to be able to resolve this particular matter. He needs to. We are calling upon him as Minister of Energy to put all these people that are here in a room. We are experts, we are private sector, we have solutions, right? He's been elected a Minister of Energy to lead the country and solve the energy crisis that is there. So why cannot he call us? We are citizens of this country responsible to solve what is coming, and we cannot let it to reach that particular point. Treasury has agreed to be behind gas to power. They have agreed. As the PPA, it is there, right? So the issue at hand is the IRP was tweaked to suit certain outcomes which are not realistic today. So the gas cliff and the baseload cliff that's going to hamper this country, at that time, it will be too late. If we are inviting Treasury, it will be too late. The Minister of Energy must be called upon to step up and resolve this particular matter as a matter of agency. If not thereof, then he must then say which other path we must then able to follow. Because all these people here, Tom, Paul, Remco, they've been there. We've been there. The RFP was issued 2023 December. We are sitting almost end of or in the middle of 2026. It's unacceptable for the country. If we have someone responsible, that is why I always say, Jaco, the agreements the president have with the ministers must be published openly, so that when we evaluate as to whether you are doing that you have agreed with your political principle, then the country can know that this matter is going to be resolved. The gas cliff problem is being there for too long. It must be resolved.
Thank you, and I hope some certainly clear direction from our panelists, and I hope some of our policy makers are also listening into this key conversation today. Again, to our match referee, Shannon, I would like to maybe move to Q&A for the next 10 minutes or so. I think we have still many of our listeners in the room. So I see there's a bunch of very interesting questions in the Q&A section. And I'm going to deal with some of them. Perhaps we don't have time to deal with everyone. Let me start with an interesting question that we've often faced. It is a question by Richard Worthington, saying why are we not promoting for the expansion and import infrastructure for LPG as a market? Is there any publicly available analysis of the prospects for replacing natural gas demand with LPG by significant industries? I think two comments before I'm going to probably ask Tom maybe to reflect on this is if we need to replace all gas with LPG today, we need to increase our infrastructure footprint and market fourfold, right? Which of course brings us to a similar infrastructure challenge. And then of course there's the question of economics, which are starkly different. But Tom, maybe you want to reflect on this as a user of gas.
Thanks, Jaco. Look, I mean, we use a lot of LPG, as you know, and we've used a lot for many years in the Western Cape. And when we made the sort of decision to start moving across to LNG supplied by energy, and it was actually on the basis that the LPG was, let's say, the most expensive alternative gas available. So it's purely an economic player. But I do take the point that if we're not able to get LNG done, then probably LPG does become does become the next alternative. But as would something like heavy fuel oil.
I think so. Thanks, Tom. Charlotte Quippens asking a question. Sorry, my cursor's just moved here. The question was around. Here we go. Sorry, got it. Do we have any updates or views on whether the future gas outlook could support the reversal of the Lily pipeline? In other words, bringing gas into the markets that we have up in Secunda and Mpumalanga. I think Tom made the point earlier on that we see any KZN development as a regional solution to the gas cliff, not a country solution. But maybe Motlokwe, if I can bat this question to you, how do you see that as a pipeline operator in the country?
Yeah, I think reversal of the Lily pipeline. Obviously, you have to take into account the size of the current pipeline, and obviously think about the size of the demand in the Gauteng region. You would obviously have to upgrade that line if you were to meet the current demand in the Gauteng region. And I think just looking at it, I mean, it's not impossible, but I think it will be commercially, I think it will be a very expensive exercise. Whether it's something that obviously makes sense given that you already, have a pipeline that already connects to the Gauteng market, and if there is alternative supply that can serve that market, it's what obviously I would potentially be seeing that as the most logical solution going forward. So that obviously means that you have potentially, as Tom has already said as well, seeing that the Richards Bay LNG would be more serving the regional demand, and then potentially the Gauteng market still being served by something either coming from Mozambique, which could be anywhere from Inosoro or could be Matola.
I want to turn to a question. Thanks, Motlokwe, for that, from Toyon Akinosho. It is around 38 million tons per annum of LNG that will be available in Mozambique by 2031. And the statement is that it is likely to have been pre-sold to customers. So the question, and it also links to other question that I also saw in the chat box, and maybe Paul, if I can turn to you, is there any benefit, do you think, in South Africa of having those access to those to that LNG? And is it still available?
Yeah, so the way LNG projects work is that the vast majority of the capacity and the output is pre-sold to customers. It's either sold to sponsors or third-party customers. So Coral South was sold to an off-taker, single off-taker, Coral North to the sponsors, Mozambique LNG to a variety of customers, Rovuma LNG will be to the sponsors. But they still have to find end markets. And where South Africa fits in and why we're pretty optimistic about it is really the shipping distance between Mozambique and South Africa. It's only three days away. So the position you essentially have is that more or less every month through the year, the individual off-takers in Mozambique will be deciding where to take their LNG. Do they sell it to Asia Pacific? Do they sell it to Europe, or do they put it into South Africa? And those dynamics are going to be affected by things like the weather in Asia Pacific. It's going to be affected by market pricing. It's also going to be affected by what is the growth of the South African market. So we see very strong linkages. It's not going to work the same way as a Sasol transaction did 20 years ago, where you have a single company buying the gas, that type of thing. You're going to have mixes. There might be an aggregator at one of the terminals, perhaps even two, but behind the scenes, the LNG will be coming probably from a variety of people in Mozambique and indeed all over the world. But the end outcome will be South Africa should get a very competitive gas price due to its location near Mozambique and also the reverse seasonality.
Tabiso, an interesting question that I want to sort of pass on to you by Mpumelelo Madlala. His question is to what extent do you believe that the I4P office actually take input from industry stakeholders on board in their decisions? This has largely got to do with corridor development, as you know. We need two corridors to be developed. The one is the ROMCO, the other one is of course KZN, at least for now. These corridors are critical to mitigate gas cliff, etc. But the question then is, to what extent are these considerations, in your opinion, taken on board by the I4P office? And the other question, probably linked to that, have these misaligned timelines been communicated to the Department of Energy and Electricity? So, yeah, your perspectives.
Yeah, the disintegration is worrisome, but that office is no more helpful to the country. I'm sorry about it because the input has always been there, but what gets out or the actions or the response reflects something very, very, very different. So it is an unfortunate situation that we have a dedicated office that needs to watch the energy security for the country and resolve it as speedily as possible, and it is not necessarily meeting that duty very well, and it's very, very unfortunate. But just touching on also the gas, one of the good things in the structures of Mozambique is they have the royalty gas. There's a certain percentage of the royalty gas which they keep, which can augur very well for South Africa in this particular instance. And we should be concluding such opportunities as police is putting it now and not wait, because sometimes our waiting and slow engagement would result at the time when we go, that gas is also gone. So it needs to be dealt with now.
Thanks, Tabiso. One last question, Shannon, and then I think we can close out. Just looking again at our time. So the question by Charlotte Quipmans, again, I think very relevant, and it's about demand stacking. and having sufficient demand to underwrite much of these key infrastructure developments. Paul has the view that infrastructure needs to be developed first, and with the necessary fiscal support and architecture that can be the catalyst for those developments. But Paul, the question is, what level of gas demand is required to facilitate FID in LNG terminals? And is the gas I4P, if you take Richards Bay or the Romco or both, whatever it is, the two gigawatts that are being considered by the I4P office, is that sufficient to bank the developments? Number one. And number two, if we need to have two developments in parallel, one out of the Romco corridor and the KZN corridor, how do we go about this? In utilizing power to build that demand stack.
No pressure there on the answer. Yeah, so I'll have a go in aggregation because obviously we're dealing with this real time. So the conceptual challenge is well outlined and it's well known. You have a certain level of industrial demand, you have a certain level of Sasol demand, which maybe can't afford the price. You have a missing element, which is a fact of life for South Africa, which is there's no heating demand, residential or office. And you have gas to power that's missing. So gas to power has to be bolted on at some point. The question is really, what is the minimum amount of gas to power you need to get the deal away? And there's obviously the IPP program going at the moment, 2 gigawatts. The general view of the world is if that is successful, that's enough. We also shouldn't forget about Avon being fuel switched, which is relevant. We shouldn't also forget that there is latent demand because the country has never really it's never been long supply. So we literally don't know what the actual demand is in many areas. We have an idea, but we don't know. Then, of course, you have the industry innovations such as small-scale LNG, marine LNG, which are going to come through. The general sense that most people have is per terminal, somewhere in the order of 80 to 100. But here you get into the technical issue, which is, are we talking about capacity or are we talking about volumes? Because if you have gas to power programs with a 50% load factor, that means your capacity is going to be higher than your volumes. So probably it's about 80 to 100 volumes, something like that, a little bit higher in terms of capacity because of the power plants. Let's say you end up at something like 120, 130. But what happens the world over on these terminals, and this is absolutely proven, is that the demand goes up over time once gas is in market because the supply source is there. People have confidence. So it's just really a question for the capital markets next year. So hopefully we can have this webinar in a year's time where we can say how much we've underwritten for the bidders, including Tabiso, and all the other participants in the chain, and we'll be equally looking forward to a close. But that's for 2027, not 2026.
Tabiso, thanks for your time and inputs today. Tom, your perspectives, Motlokwe, your insights. Paul, always educational listening to you. I hope this was a fruitful and informative webinar, and I would like to thank the Kramer Media team for arranging this very pertinent and, as I said at the beginning, timely discussion. We are at a point where we are compelled to make some key decisions, and clearly we need the central leadership to take and bring all these loose strings and loose ends together. Shannon, I'm going to hand over back to you, and I would like to thank also our audience for your active participation in the chat box. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jaco. And yes, Paul, watch the space. We'll be in touch. That brings us to the end of today's discussion. A big thank you to our facilitator, Jaco Human from the Industrial Gas Users Association, Southern Africa, and our panelists, Paul Erdley-Taylor from Standard Bank, Thomas Shaw from Gas Hub, Motlokwe Sebake from Romco, and Tabiso Tenyane from Pakwe Group. Thank you also to the attendees for joining us and for contributing through your questions and comments. We'd like to once again thank our sponsors, Richards Bay Industrial Development Zone, Standard Bank, and CNG Holdings for making this webinar possible. The recording of today's session will be shared soon, so keep an eye out for that email. And we'd also like to invite you to join us for our next webinar on the 8th of April at 2 p.m. It will focus on tailings innovations and the impact of responsible land rehabilitation. You'll find the registration link in the chat. If you'd like to stay up to date with our upcoming webinars and news, please be sure to sign up for our free daily newsletter or visit our website. You can also reach us at shannon@creamermedia.co.za. From all of us at Creamer Media Webinars, thank you for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.